Welcome back, everyone, to another Technique Coding online tutorial class. In this class, we are continuing our iOS authentication with a Django backend tutorial. The last video we went over, we created a where we set up a Django project, and we got everything up and running for the basics, such as setting up the project settings file, getting the admin site up and running, creating and migrating the database. And you should be at this point now where we have a Django admin running and you have the project set up. So in this video, what we will be doing is we'll be creating a registration endpoint where users can ping in order to create their own account. So it'll be half done because what we have to do in that registration endpoint, we also have to send out a activation email for two-factor authentication. Now, we won't be able to actually send the email out yet until we get the activation endpoint running. So without further ado, let's get this registration endpoint going so we can move on to that either in this video or the next one. So the first thing we have to do is, well, go to the views file. Again, real quick, views, if I didn't mention this in a previous video, in Django, the way Django is set up, views is actually where the endpoints are created. You can create a new Python file named APIs and stick them in there. The difference is we are going to have a urls.py file within our API app. Through that, we can tell the requests where to go. That's kind of the routing of each Django app that we have here. So we're just going to leave everything in the views file because that's normal Django-ness, I guess you could say. Standard Django practice, but you don't have to if you don't want to, and it might be more reasonable for you not to put them in the views file. So continuing on. So the first thing we need to do is we have to do some importing here. So we're going to get rid of this render method. And what we're going to do is we're going to say from Rest Framework, again, which is the library we're using to create these APIs. We're going to import the response. This is an object that's actually going to be returned in our views. And that is going to be mapped out to an actual HTTP response object. We're going to also need from Rest Framework .generics generic API view, and this is kind of where the Django Rest Framework starts to hook into that JWT library we downloaded. Go back to the settings, and you can remember we included the Rest Framework simple JWT, and we hooked it into the Rest Framework. If we scroll all the way to the bottom, we hooked it into the Rest Framework using this Rest Framework settings. Now, because we did that, this generic API view, which is coming from the Rest Framework, actually already has authentication inside of it. So we don't even have to do anything as far as securing these endpoints. As long as we make these endpoints, they will automatically be secure as long as they subclass a Rest Framework view. So the other thing we need to do as well is we need to import allow any. So from Rest Framework permissions import allow any. So because each of our views or endpoints that will subclass a Rest Framework view, because they already out of the box are secure, most of these endpoints, when it comes to registering user, they actually shouldn't be secure because users won't have a login token or access token or any of that stuff if they want to register for the app. So we actually have to open those specific endpoints up using this allow any. That's what this will be used for. So the permission on this registration view will actually be to allow anyone access to it so they can register. Let's see, what else do we need here? We also need from Rest Framework import status. This is actually useful. This has inside of it, actually we can probably just go inside and show you. So this has a bunch of status codes that we can just grab using autocomplete, and they're very descriptive. They tell you exactly what they do. So basically 204 created or 201 created is what we're after. And you don't really have to memorize what each one does because they have this nice definition on them. So we import that to make our lives a little bit easier. Let's see what else we're going to need. We're going to need to import the user model. So let's just scroll up here. I usually like keeping the Django imports up top and then any third-party imports a little bit lower. Trib conf. Actually, it's auth. Django.trib auth or get user model. Basically, what we're doing here is Django out of the box comes with a user model for the database. Now, we can actually define one custom and then tell Django to use that. Now, instead of trying to keep track of where that model is within our project, because it's such a ubiquitous model that's used pretty much anywhere and you can't access it anywhere, using this get user model. So we don't have to actually keep track of where that is as long as we use this built-in Django method called get user model, and it fetches us the actual class type. This isn't an instance, this is just the class type that we can use to build or create user instances from. Then from there, what we're going to want is we are going to want a couple validators here. So Django is actually kind of nice because out of the box, it comes with a bunch of these validators right here. I'm also importing validation error because we'll need that for error checking, but Django is nice because it comes built in with a lot of these validators, something like email validator, for instance. So we're going to be able to use this to validate an individual's email rather than come up with our own and have to go through that hassle of making sure that any kind of like regex expression, which is really cumbersome to maintain, is correct. So we're just going to use these pre-built-in methods in classes. So now let's actually start creating this endpoint. So what we need to do is say class register app user generic API view permission classes, and this is a property that's built into the generic API view, but we can actually set it and say allow any. So now what's going to happen is any kind of endpoints we have inside this class will automatically be open completely and have no permissions on them. So you can access them without an access token or password or anything else. We can also do it on individual endpoints, but it's easier for right here just to do it on the class itself because, well, we don't need it anywhere else. Or I should say, we don't need any secure endpoints within this class. Post, and this is another Django Rest Framework pattern where now we have a post endpoint. We can also do define get, put, delete. Any of the RESTful verbs we can use there, but for this one we're using post. So now what we have to do is we have to get the data out of this request. Now Django Rest Framework, inside this request, there is a array called data. So we can do email equals request dot data email if email in request not whole string in request dot data else none. So this, if you're not familiar with Python, this is just a ternary operator. It's the same thing in other languages. If you do email equals something equals true, this else that, right? Or it's just the Python way of doing this. Now, in actuality, this is pretty verbose. This is one way to check it, but what we're going to do is we're going to use a nice little function that Python has on its arrays, and it's called the get. It's the get method. And what this is going to do is it's either going to get the value inside this, sorry, this is an addiction. It's a dictionary, not an array. It's going to try to get the value named email within this dictionary, and if that doesn't exist, it's going to return none. This is the default value. You can also make this anything you want. So this is a little bit less verbose, so we're just going to stick with this. Request.data.get password, default to none, and then we're going to do confirm password. Note that what we're doing here is the actual client, so the mobile app, will be able to actually send anything it wants in the JSON payload that we consume here. So it could add email, like a value called email to, username, anything it wants. The way we create this schema is we're just defining what we expect, and then we document what we expect. The client can send anything it wants, but if it doesn't at least have these, then we're going to return and say there's an error because we're expecting these values. That's all defining this endpoint is really. So what we're going to do now is we need to check to see if those values actually exist and then return that error I mentioned. Response. And this is where I mentioned that status object is going to be really, or that status import is going to be really useful because we can just click on that and return the correct status code that we're looking for. This is taking in a string. This could actually be anything. It doesn't have to be just a string. This could be a dictionary. It could be an array of strings. It could be whatever you want to return. Generally speaking, if you want to return a dictionary, that's usually a JSON payload. You would use a JSON response instead. If you're using the Django Rest Framework, there is this concept of serializers that will automatically map a data model into a JSON payload or a data object to return as a JSON payload. That is outside the scope of this. Take a look at the Django Rest Framework docs if you want to learn more. Right now, we're just doing simple to keep the tutorial, well, within reason. I don't want us to be spending 18 weeks on this thing. So we need to validate what we get now. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to say data validation errors equals this. So what I'm doing here, you could, as soon as you hit an error, return back what that error is. What I tend to like to do is, if there's a bunch of errors that could be accumulated at once, I tend to put them in an array and then return the array so the client can then decide if I have multiple errors, tell the user either all of them, one of them, handle them individually, or what have you. I like to allow the client the opportunity to handle it in its own way. What we're going to do is we're going to say if password does not equal confirm password, data validation errors append. We're going to use double quotes here because again, I'm going to have a single quote inside that string. Nice thing about Python is you can use double quotes or single quotes for strings. And if you need a single quote, you just use double quotes to contain it. Okay. Next thing we need to do is we need to check the email validation. So we're going to be doing try validator. And we're going to do like that. So that's all we need to validate that email. And basically what it's going to do is if this email is not valid, it's going to throw an error. Most things in Python, they try to err on the side of explicitly erroring out and throwing exceptions. And then the caller handles it in whatever way they see fit. And here's where that validation error comes into play. We can print the error if we want, just to see what it is. Here, you would usually either raise this error in bug trackers like Sentry or Crashlytics, or I can't remember if Crashlytics actually is just for mobile or not, but I use Sentry. to actually register these bugs. And I don't know, I highly recommend it. I'm not an affiliate of them at all. It's just what I use. I found pretty good use out of them. Data validator, append, e.messages. Okay, so if that fails, we are handling that. The next thing we need to do is we need to make sure so there's only 2 locations where we could spot an error. So now we need to check whether or not there was an error, and if there was, we're gonna return a response to the client stating that there was. If length of data validators is greater than 0, return response data validation errors, that array, the status, there we go, status dot 400 bad request. So now the client will know if one or more of those errors happened, and then the user can figure out what they want to do. Because if they have 2 errors, like the passwords don't actually match, and there was an email validation error, they're going to know both at the same time rather than have to fix one and then get another error afterwards. Now's the kit caboodle, the meat and potatoes, if you will. So we're going to actually create the user model and in the database. So we're going to be doing try user model equals, we actually have that. User equals user, come on, there we go, Rob. User model dot objects dot create user. Now the Django docs go over this part pretty well. I'm not going to go over it too much. Just know that this method is specific to the user model, and what it's doing is it's actually creating and persisting this user in the database in this one call. So even though we are actually getting the user right here, this call is doing both of those, and we're just actually storing the returned user in a variable. So we're going to use name equals email, email equals email, password, and is active equals false. This should default to is active equals false. I can't remember off the top of my head if it does or not. So you might be able to leave this out, but we're just explicitly stating that it's false right here just for clarity. The one thing to keep in mind too is that Django does have an option to state what the quote-unquote username field is. So you can actually say that the email, should be email. You will be able to state inside the Django model itself, if you subclass it, whether or not you want to use the username field or email field for the username. Sometimes you just don't want a username. You just want to keep their username as the email because it's easier and you don't want to deal with that. So we need to finish this off by just doing except integrity error, which I'll have to import. db-utils import integrity error. And what this is going to say is if this user already exists, this is going to throw an integrity error and say, hey, you can't do that in the database. Now, if you're not familiar with Python, what I just did here with this string, if you prefix a string with F, it means it's a formatted string, and you can add properties and variables inside the string that will automatically be converted into a string using that method. It's actually the preferred way right now, just because of how Python handles strings. There you go. And it's a 409 because there is a conflict in the database. So now what we have to do is the next part that I write won't actually work yet. We have a lot more to do in order to get it to work. So what I need to do is success equals send activation email user. This doesn't exist yet. We'll get to that here shortly. Success, turn, response, send email. Status equals status.500. Now this one is an internal server error because something in that email has failed, and it's most likely a configuration on the server. And then if all of that happens, we can do return, response, tool created. So that's it for the endpoint, really. Other than these two things, which I'm going to comment these out right now just because we can't use them yet because they don't exist. But this is the full endpoint on what we will be using. Now, it's not hooked up to anything yet. So basically, this is just a function. We could technically use it, create a Django test to test it, but it's kind of convoluted to do that without setting up routing. So in order to hook this up, in order to be able to receive a request and then route it to this method, we have to set up the routing for this. The first thing we have to do that is create a file, new Python file called URLs inside of our Django app. So let me just make sure I got everything here. Okay, so from here, we're going to say path. And we're also going to say from the current package, import our views so we can reference all of the views we have created in here, aka endpoints. Now, Django will look for some predefined things here. So in order for, we can namespace our URLs, and we should. To do that, we can say app name equals API. And Django will look for this variable called API within the URLs directory file right here. And then we can reference this by name using this API string right here. The next thing that Django expects there to be is a URL patterns list. And this is literally where the routing happens. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to say path register views.register app user.asView. Now, I won't go over this too much because there's a difference between, these are called class-based views. There's also function-based views, which they look a lot more like, instead of saying class register app user, you would do def register user, and that would be one endpoint. And then you'd have to have, for Rest Framework, you'd have to have mix-ins. I can't remember, I think they're post or something like that, or I can't remember exactly off the top of my head what they are, but there's a difference. And that's why we say as view, because we have to call that Django Rest Framework and class-based views require this in order for it to work with inside the path. I'm not going to go over that right now. That's something to take a look into. Just know that because we're using class-based views, we have to call this method. And one thing that we're not going to use for this particular endpoint, but it's useful, is we're going to name it. Like that. The reason this is important is because, not for this endpoint, but for the next one, which is the activation endpoint, is because we can actually reference this path using the prefix and the name together. So later on, you'll see something, we'll be creating a activation link, and in that link, you'll see something like, top of my head, what is it? I think it's reverse. And then what you do is you say you want the link to be this. And then keyword args equal, whatever is in there, right? So Django will then use this method that we're going to be using here in the future to say, okay, the namespace right here with the registration. So it's going to say, all right, within this file, look for a path named registration. And then what it's going to do is it's going to reverse it out and create an actual URL from that. So that's why naming is important. We can actually use the name rather than having to manually type this out. So now that we have the URLs here, it's still not connected. So the entry point of the entire project, we have to register this URLs file with now. So when a request comes in, the first thing that's going to hit is this app name. So in our settings area, the URL is right here, right? I believe this is defined in here. Settings. Can't remember off the top of my head where this file is actually configured inside. I think it might be in the settings, but in any case, this is the file that will get hit first. So within here, it's going to, a request is then going to look at each record inside this array and say, does this URL match anything that's in here? So you're going to have the base URL, and then directly after the base URL, so if it's like mysite.com/admin, then it's going to say, hey, there's the path, reroute that to the admin site.urls. For us, though, we need to include path API, and I believe it's include API.urls. Double check that real quick. Yep, that's right. All right. So now when a new request comes in, it's going to check see if there's an admin right after the base URL. And if there's not, it's going to check to see if there's an API characters right after the base URL. And if it is, then it's going to drill down into the URLs directory file we just made. And it's going to say, hey, now after the base URL /API/ is there a register? So basically it's looking for base URL /API /register in our URL, right? And if that's, there has to be a / at the end too. And if that exists, then it's going to route that request to our register app user. So now we are all set. So now if we actually rerun this, let me just click this again to rerun it. Before I do anything else, let's just refresh the list of users here. So we only have the webmaster. We go back into Postman, and I'm going to register a new user here. And so you can see the entire thing. Let me just rename this app@example.com. And I'll hit send. And success. An activation email has been sent to this email. Now, it hasn't actually been sent out because we didn't actually set up the activation email stuff. But what it did was it hit the endpoint and it created a new user object. So if you go back into the admin site and then we hit refresh, you can see that it's now there. And that is the registration endpoint. So that was really quick just to put that up there. In the next video, I'm gonna go over the activation endpoint because we're gonna need that to finish the registration endpoint. We need the activation endpoint to actually create that link to send out to the user. So I will put that in the next one, and we are starting to come together here. We have our first endpoint. And yeah, I will see you in the next one, and happy coding.